I'm the youngest of five, and I have 8 nieces and nephews, and I just love being the priest uncle. It's super, super fun. And how many of you have younger brothers and sisters? Okay, so really, really young. So when they were really young, I was ordained like 8 years ago. And when I was first ordained, they had a big dilemma, you know, and you know how like the little ones have big dilemmas, and their big dilemma was this: what are we gonna call Uncle Joe, right? Because everybody was calling me father. So like, what are we gonna call Uncle Joe? And they were like freaking out, and I didn't know about it. So they came up with what they still think is the funniest thing in the entire world, and it's a combination of father and uncle, and so they call me Frunkle Joe all the time, you know? They're like, Frunkle Joe, then we coming up for community. They're like, Frunkle. I'm like, not now, kids, keep moving, you know? So I was out visiting 5 of them. My sister Ann has 5 kids under 10 years old, right? And so she's like, thank you. Well, she'd appreciate that. Oh, right? And so I was out in Champaign, Illinois. My brother-in-law actually has a broom corn factory. They make and they sell brooms. So guess what I get every Christmas, right? I'm like, thanks, Dave. Another broom. This is awesome. And I was out visiting them, and I was flying back from Champaign back to Pittsburgh and at a layover in Chicago. So I was going Champaign to Chicago, Chicago to Pittsburgh. Well, the flight from Champaign to Chicago is super, super short. It's like, I don't know, 25, 30 minutes, right? And so if you guys have ever flown on one of these little planes, they put you on these tiny little planes, right? We call them a puddle jumper. They're like perfect for a hobbit. They're like this big. You're like, is that really going to get off the ground? And so I'm like waiting to get on this super little plane. And I'm not a huge guy, but nobody's ever accused me of being petite, right? And so I'm like waiting to get on the plane, and the widest, most muscular dude I've ever seen in my life got up to get on the same plane as me. This guy, and I played college football, so I've been around some big dudes. This guy was jacked out of his mind. I mean, his legs were muscular, his chest, his ears were muscular. Everything was like, he's like flexing his ear. I'm like, oh man, that's pretty sweet, you know? And so this dude, he was all tatted up, and he had piercings and this huge man beard, you know, and I'm looking at, he was like the most intimidating guy I'd ever seen. And so all I could think to myself, because I'm a bad person, I was like, oh, Lord, don't let him sit next to me, you know? So I'm like on the back of this plane because I bought my ticket super late, and I'm like next to the bathroom, and so it stinks, and like the fuselage is like, so I'm already like cramped in there, and all of a sudden I see this dude start walking down the aisle, you know? And he looked like a bull going after the matador. He was like, like this, you know? I'm like, oh, Lord, don't do it to me. And so he starts walking back, right? He's coming right for the only open seat is right next to me. And he stops, you know, and I'm looking up at him, and he looks down at the seat, and he looks at me, and he says, I think that's my seat, you know. I was like, I think any seat you want is your seat, but whatever, man. So this dude sat down, right? Guys, I'm not kidding you. When he sat down, my whole body just pancaked just like this. Against his tricep was like breaking my ribs. I was like, I'm gonna die, you know? And so I'm just dying and dying there. I'm like, okay, I can handle it. It's a 25-minute flight, you know, no problem. And so I because I didn't want to talk, I pretended like I was falling asleep. You know, which never works. Like, and all of a sudden, he asked the question that everybody always asks when they see a young priest wearing a collar. They always ask this, and he asked it. He said, are you a priest? You know? I was like, are you the Incredible Hulk? And so we started talking about, I said, yeah, man, I'm a priest. It's not Halloween. I'm a priest, right? And so we started talking, and man, talk about like judging a book by its cover. This is why we can never like judge somebody from their external appearance. This dude started just to open up his heart to me. Just started sharing with me about his life, and basically what he was saying was this: is, Father, I'm not happy, you know? And I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about it, man. And he said, I used to be Catholic, you know? And I was like, we got about 20 minutes. You're about to be Catholic again, right? Let's talk. So we started to talk, and Father, I'm not happy. And then he's tell me about what's going on in your life, what's going on in your heart. And he said, Father, I've achieved all my dreams. Like all the things that I set out to do, I've achieved. He said, Father, one of my big goals was to make $1 million before I was 30. He was 28 years old, he said, when he made his first $1 million. He was super, super successful monetarily. He had tons of money. And so he's like, Father, I made all this money. And then I'm like, oh, okay. And he's like, and then what I did with that money, Father, is I like went out and just partied, and then the women and the pleasure, and like I just chased after that world, and it didn't make me happy, Father. And so now I'm into this bodybuilding thing. He was like the 14th ranked bodybuilder in North America. And so he's like, I've gotten fame, you know, in his bodybuilding world from that. So like I've achieved all the things I've wanted to the world. And I'm like, what's the problem? He said, I'm still not happy, Father. Man, I just started sharing about God. Real simple. I'm not an eloquent guy. I just started like talking to him just about Jesus and about how God is real. And I know it's hard sometimes, guys, because we can only like relate. We're so used to relating to each other. We have bodies, right? We can see each other. And sometimes relating to God is much more difficult. So I started speaking to him about the love of God. And what you're looking for is the love of Jesus. I started talking about how his heart thirsts, right? What we've been talking about here, for the love of God. And nothing but him will satisfy. Guys, I'm not kidding you. The next thing I knew, this guy was bawling his eyes out, right? Crying on my shoulder, which was awkward because he had no neck, so he was like this, like trying to hold him, like everybody's like, what's going on? I'm like, don't worry about it. It happens all the time, right? But guys, that's what we all want. That's what we're saying at this conference. What this guy basically was saying to me was, Father, I thirst. Father, I thirst. How many of you have ever heard of Tom Brady? Okay, all right. Pittsburghers, we've heard of him. He's been torturing us, right? Brady's getting interviewed. Is somebody cheering for Tom Brady? Okay. He's getting interviewed, right? Check this out. You can YouTube it. Brady's getting interviewed. We'll call the interviewer's name Bob on 60 Minutes. And he's getting interviewed, and Bob says to Tom, Tom, you must be the happiest guy in the world. And Tom says, why? This is from 2005. He says, because you just signed a $60 million contract. $60 million. He said, besides that, you're dating the most beautiful woman in the world, Giselle. She said, you're like, too far, Father, I know. Chill. He said, besides that, like, he said, all right, come back to me now. Besides that, like, you're so famous, Brady, you must be so happy. And Tom, I loved his honesty, at least at this moment. He said, Brady goes, man, he said, Bob, I look at all these things I have, all this money, all this power, all this pleasure, all this fame. I look at everything that I have. And I go, is that it? Is that all the world has to offer me? There's got to be more. And Bob, the interviewer, goes, well, what's the more, Tom? What's the more? And Brady's face gets almost desperate. Watch it. And he goes, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. At that moment, I wanted to jump through the screen and be like, I know what it is, man. Like, we're all looking for the same thing, guys. We're all looking for God, right? Jesus is walking on the banks of the Jordan River, right? And John and Andrew are following him. He turns around and then he asks them, what are you looking for? He knows what they were looking for. They were looking for him, right? We thirst for God. Our hearts will never be satisfied. All the money, all the power, all the pleasure, all the fame. We can do all that stuff. It will never satisfy the deepest desire of the human heart. We want God. Check this out. What does God want for us? What does God want for us? He wants to satisfy that. We don't have this desire just so we stay in it. He wants to come in with the power of his love and satisfy that desire. He wants to fill this heart. We say this, God, I thirst, and God says, I satiate. I satisfy. That's what the Eucharist is, guys. That's what the Mass is. It's God going like this. I'm for you. This is my body given up for you. I know you thirst. So I'm going to give away to give myself to you fully. That's why Mass is so powerful. That's why it's heaven on earth, not subjectively because I feel like I'm in heaven, objectively. Because God comes down from heaven onto this altar. He's going to walk off of this altar into our hearts, into our thirst. The two thirsts here meet. Man, that's why Mass is heaven on earth, not because we're entertained, not because it's fun, not because of because it's where we meet God in the most crazy, profound way. It's incredible. This is where the gospel comes in. What happens when we receive God's love? This is where the gospel comes in, and sometimes we check out when the readings are read, but 5 times in 10 verses, Jesus says the same thing. Same thing. 5 times in 10 verses, he says this, do not be afraid. Do not be anxious. Do not worry. He says it a few different ways, but he says it 5 times. Do not be afraid. Do you know that phrase appears 365 times in the scriptures? There's a reason it appears that many times. When I was your age, man, middle school especially, and in high school when I was your age and into college, I suffered so bad from anxiety and fear. I was so insecure as a kid. I still have to battle with a little bit. It's gotten so much better. But I was your age. I was so worried about what other people thought of me. Matt talked about this a bit in his own life last night. But I wanted so desperately to be accepted and to be loved and to be welcomed. And so I was like a chameleon. You guys know what a chameleon is? I asked a group of 8th graders, what's a chameleon do? The kid was like, eats flies. I was like, I know that, right? changes colors. And so I don't know if you guys have experienced that, but like when the cool kids were around, I'd always act cool and I'd talk cool and I'd dress cool and I don't have to worry about that anymore. And like if the bad kids were around, then I'd act bad and I'd act out and I'd do whatever they did. And if the athletes were around, then I'd act athletic and I'd watch SportsCenter just so I could talk about sport. And I was always like trying to be the person that I thought other people would like me for. You know that's tiring. It's an exhausting way to live, but that's how I lived most of my life, right? Has anybody here seen the movie Gladiator? Okay, wow, okay, I'm surprised. It's kind of old school movie, right? At the end of the movie Gladiator, right, the emperor's with the gladiator, and the emperor's about to fight the gladiator, and the emperor sees that the gladiator knows he's afraid, and so the emperor says this, "What, do you think I'm afraid?" The gladiator says this, I think you've been afraid your whole life. I think you've been afraid your whole life. That's me. That was me. Just fearful my whole life. Doesn't fear just cripple us? It freezes us up. The devil loves us fearful because when we're fearful, we can't soar. We're meant to soar. We're meant to live life to the absolute abundance, to the full. And fear just cripples us up. It enslaves us, right? That's how I went through most of my life. And I entered the seminary right after college, and I went over to study in Rome, Italy, and I brought all that stuff with me, all that baggage, all that fear. I was still trying to prove myself to other people, trying to prove myself. Here, love me. I'm good at sports. Love me. Tell me I'm somebody. I'm funny. Tell me I'm somebody. I'm this. Tell me I'm somebody. I just need to know that I'm special and unique. And all that stuff stayed with me. Right before my diaconate, you ordained a deacon. Right before you ordained a priest. And right before my diaconate, my parents were coming over. I was ordained in Rome. And they love art. And so they wanted me to take them to an art gallery up in Florence. And I was dying, man. Like, I couldn't sleep at night. I could hardly eat, which you know I'm nervous if I can't eat. And I was just struggling. They came over. We went up to a place called the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And in Florence, or in this gallery, we're walking around it, right? And my mom and dad are art lovers. Said, like, this is so beautiful. And I'm like, I'm going to die, you know? We're walking around, and then we go into this one room called the Botticelli room. And when I walked in, Botticelli's a famous Italian artist, and this picture caught me, this painting caught me. Just caught my eye. You know how sometimes paintings or books do that? And I just beeline towards it. I went right over to this painting, and it's called the Calumny of Apelles, and it totally blew my mind. And what happened was this, what this painting is this. There's this king, and his name's Apelles, and he's sitting on his throne, and he used to be sitting very regally and strong, and it's almost like the painting's in motion because his hands are beginning to get curled in, and he's beginning to grow very dark, and he's beginning to get real curved in on himself. And here's why: because all the vices are lined up, they're personified, so like jealousy and gossip and envy and hatred, and they're all coming to speak lies into his ear. And as the king listens to all the lies, he's starting to get very much afraid. See, that's what we do. We listen to the lie. What's the lie say? You're not loved. What's the lie say? You're not beautiful. What's the lie say? You're not special. You have to prove yourself. And then we spend a lifetime trying to prove ourselves. We don't have to. At the very back of that line is truth. And truth is naked, and she's pointing up to heaven to say that the only place you can look for your worth and your dignity is God. He's the one who can really tell you. Guys, when I was looking at that painting, you remember the baptism of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark? It says that the heavens were torn open, the voice of the Father was heard. This is what happened to me. I heard the voice of God the Father, not in my ears, but in my heart. And this is what God the Father said so powerfully to my heart: Joe, you are my beloved Son. With you, I am well pleased. Man, that was it. That was the defining moment in my life, right? From that moment on, I didn't have to be afraid anymore. I didn't have to prove myself anymore. I didn't have to prove my worth to others. I didn't have to prove my worth to myself. I could just be now, and I was free. We sang that song last night, man. I had my hands up over here. I'm like bawling my eyes out. Everybody's looking at me. What's up with that guy? You know? I'm no longer a slave of fear. I am a child of God. That's it. When our thirst is satiated, when we take the thirst of our hearts and open up to the only one who can satiate, and that is Jesus, he frees us. He frees us from fear, and he allows us to live. I'm no longer a slave of fear. I am a child of God. Here's what's awesome. You don't have to wait for a moment like I had. You don't have to wait for some huge epiphany, for some huge crazy feeling. It's the truth, and it's given to you right now. All we have to do is claim it. I will not remain a slave of fear anymore. I am a child of God. That's my deepest identity. That's why I have worth, and that's what I'm going to build my whole life on.